All right, today we're jumping in the time machine and heading back to the 17th and 18th centuries. We're going to talk about what school even meant in the American colonies. And you might be picturing, a little red schoolhouse for everyone, but the reality? It was more like three totally different worlds, all existing at the exact same time.
So let's start with the biggest question of all. In a world that's all about survival, farming, and just making a living, why even bother teaching kids to read and write? What was the actual point? And the fascinating thing is, the colonists themselves had completely different answers to that question.
And that right there, that's the key to this whole thing. Education in colonial America wasn't one size fits all. It was basically a mirror that reflected the society it was in. And it was all shaped by where you lived, who your family was, and, maybe the biggest factor of all, your gender.
To really get a grip on these different systems, you first have to understand what the goals were. See, colonial education wasn't just about learning stuff for the sake of learning. No, it was a tool. It was designed to build a very specific kind of society and to shape a very specific kind of person.
I mean, the different priorities are just crystal clear when you look at it this way. Up in Puritan New England, literacy was about saving your soul. You had to be able to read the Bible. But then you jump over to the middle colonies, super diverse, very commercial, and education was all about practical skills you needed to be a merchant or an artisan. And down in the aristocratic South, well, education was basically a luxury item designed to get the sons of the rich ready to rule their plantations and keep the social order just the way it was.
So, let's start by following the path of a colonial boy. For him, school was a door into the public world of leadership, the church, the law, and business. The entire system was built to prepare him for a life outside of the home.
The curriculum for most boys started with the basics, right? The 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. But for the boys who were on a path to leadership, it went way further. Latin and Greek weren't just for showing off. They were the essential languages you had to know for college, for theology, for law. This was the fast track for the future leaders of the community.
And this date, 1636, this tells you everything you need to know about their priorities. Harvard was founded just 16 years after the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. And its main goal wasn't just broad learning, it was super specific, to make sure there was always a supply of literate ministers for the churches. So, higher education for men, yeah, that wasn't an afterthought. It was a top priority from the very beginning.
But let's be really clear here. Not every boy got to walk this academic path, not even close. Social class created this huge divide. On one hand, you have a wealthy boy. He's going to a grammar school, he's getting private tutors, he's got his sights set on Harvard. On the other hand, you have a poorer boy. If he's lucky enough to get any schooling, he's probably just learning to read a little before he's sent off to an apprenticeship to learn a hands-on trade. The classroom doors just opened a lot wider if you had money. Okay, so that's the boys' world. Now let's completely flip the script and look at the life of a colonial girl. If a boy's education was a path to the public square, a girl's education was a path that led right back to the front door of her own home. It was designed from top to bottom for a private domestic life. I mean, the curriculum for girls just tells a completely different story. Sure, reading was often encouraged, again, mostly so she could read her Bible. But the focus was overwhelmingly on practical skills. Think about it. Where the boys' curriculum had Latin and Greek, the girls had sewing and household management. The goal wasn't to develop her intellect, it was to make her domestically proficient.
And really, this quote just says it all. The entire purpose of a girl's education was to get her ready for marriage and motherhood, to make her a good wife, an efficient manager of a home. It was totally functional, not aspirational, and it was all tied up in her very specific role in society.
Now, there was a little bit of a glimmer of change, especially if you were wealthy. As the 18th century went on, you started to see some private academies for girls pop up. But even here, the focus was often on accomplishments, things like music and proper etiquette, skills that were designed to make a young woman a more appealing candidate for marriage, not to equip her for a life of the mind.
Okay, so we've seen the huge difference between education for boys and for girls. Now let's stack geography on top of that and see how these gendered systems actually played out across the three very distinct colonial regions.
So up in New England, education was seen as this community-wide religious duty. They actually passed laws that required towns to set up schools. And it was all in service of one big goal: creating a society of moral, Bible-reading citizens. Then you have the middle colonies, which were a total melting pot of different cultures and religions, and their approach to education really showed that. There wasn't one single system, but this patchwork of private schools and church-run schools, and almost all of them were focused on the practical skills you needed for business and trade.
And then we go down south with its huge plantations and really strict social hierarchy, and it's a completely different world. Public schools, almost non-existent. Instead, education was a status symbol for the wealthy, who would hire private tutors to get their sons ready to manage the family estate and their daughters ready to manage the household.
And this table right here, this is where it all comes together. This is the whole story at a glance. You can just see the massive differences from region to region. A boy in New England had a clear path to college. In the South, it was all about private tutors. And notice the one constant pretty much everywhere for girls. Their education was overwhelmingly domestic. Getting any real academics was a rare luxury reserved for the absolute tippy top of society.
So what's the big takeaway from all this? The crucial point is that colonial education wasn't just about teaching kids facts and figures. It was about shaping people for a very specific way of life. Whether the main goal was religious devotion, business success, or aristocratic rule, the classroom was the place where a region's deepest values were passed on to the next generation.
And that kind of leaves us with a big question for ourselves, doesn't it? If their education was a mirror reflecting their values, what does our modern education system reflect about ours? What are we really training our kids for today? Career success? Engaged citizenship? Personal fulfillment? It's definitely something worth thinking about. Thanks for joining us.